How we doing, folks? Your host Moose here on the Pitt Panthers Football Network as we welcome you to our Season 5 2020 Week 10 Around the NCAA recap show. Of course, your Pitt Panthers unfortunately took their first loss of this college football season at home against rival Notre Dame. Jumped out to a 6-3 lead at the half. Of course, could have been 10-3, but they had a touchdown negated by a holding call. Notre Dame took advantage with 2 touchdowns late in the third quarter to end up taking the lead, which they never relinquished and ended up holding off the Panthers 24-21. So tough game for Pitt. They just couldn't do anything defensively. You see Notre Dame passed the ball well, they ran the ball well, and they converted on third down very, very well, which was really the difference in the game. Notre Dame 12 of 16 on third down conversions. Pitt 0 for 2 on 2-point conversions as well, which really hurt them because if they make those 2-point conversions, number one, if they made both of them, then they're in the lead. If they made even one of them, then they're within a point. And if they'd have taken just the extra points, they're within a point and would have at least had an opportunity to maybe even let Notre Dame score and get the ball back for one last chance to tie the game. As it was, Notre Dame ran the clock out and the Panthers surrendered their first loss. Great game for Kenny Pickett. He had to really do it all for the Panthers because they got nothing going on the ground. Todd Sibley led the way with 18 rushing yards. A pitiful performance for the Panthers. Nobody on the team averaged even 2 yards a carry. Pickett threw for 340 yards. Incredible game for him and a touchdown. He also ran for one. 195 of those yards going to Jay Keys on 9 catches, though he did have 2 drops. And the question remains, what would have been if Keys would have caught that pass in the end zone with a little over 5 minutes to play in the fourth quarter? If he catches that and the Panthers score a touchdown, which they did still score a touchdown on that drive, but if they score a touchdown in a much quicker fashion, then who knows what would have been the opportunity for them to stop Notre Dame and get the ball back with one last chance to try and win the game, or even let Notre Dame score and still have enough time to run a drive. As it was, Notre Dame ran the clock out. Tough day for Michael Collins at right tackle. Aquara completely dominated him. 3 sacks given up on the day. Interesting stats you saw too from the Panthers. They moved the ball well, but some big drops across the field. Onyango had a huge drop in the red zone. Sibley had a drop where he couldn't get past a hit. And so it was a tough day for the Panthers. They couldn't make the big plays when they needed to. You can see only 1 sack on the day. They're known for great sack presence and getting into the pressuring the quarterbacks very well. They couldn't do it. Ryan Jacobs had the only sack. Chase Pine did have a great interception forced by a Scott Whaley hit on the quarterback, but they just didn't do enough to disrupt the function of the Notre Dame offense. Another great game for Jay Bump. He's well on his way to, I think, winning the Groza Award. 3 for 3 field goals, made a 55-yarder. Great game for him. Eric Fox had an okay game, did have 1 punt inside the 20, and his net was good, but his distance was not great. So it's a good game for the Panthers, but where they got torn up was by these 2 Notre Dame quarterbacks. Ian Book went out with an injury. He still had a great game, 144 yards, threw a touchdown, did have the 1 pick, but Dale Smith, the redshirt freshman, showing him some incredible poise. He comes in, runs for 40 yards, passes for 88 and 2 touchdowns on 11 of 12 passing. This guy has a great future for Notre Dame. When Ian Book graduates at the end of this season, Dale Smith is going to be an absolute beast for them. There's no doubt about that. And he's got a lot of great weapons as well. Ken Murray, his number 1 target today, 6 for 55 and a touchdown. He's just a redshirt sophomore, so those 2 will link up for sure next year and possibly even the year after that. Aquara led the way for Notre Dame with 3 sacks. Incredible performance for him. Pitt finally didn't surrender a turnover for the first time, I think, all season. And, of course, they lose the game. So what are the odds of that? But a tough loss for the Panthers. Thankfully for them, around the country, some other big teams did lose, which we'll see as we get around. Clemson won, though. Penn State is going to go ahead of the Panthers in the rankings. Their win over Virginia Tech, 35-32, as will Houston, who's still undefeated after beating Georgia Tech. North Carolina fell to BYU. Virginia knocked off Duke to get their first ACC win of the season. NC State beat Minnesota. Louisville, 38-17 over Syracuse. And Boston College on a slide. They look good. I think they started the season 4-1. They're now 4-4 after losing to New Mexico State. In the top 25, Army goes to 8-1 with a victory over Air Force, so tight victory there for the Black Knights. Alabama stays unbeaten. They're going to stay at number 1 in the country with their victory over UConn. Ole Miss knocks off then 7-1 Texas A&M with a fourth quarter touchdown throw from their backup quarterback Muhammad to Angels. So interesting contradiction, or not contradiction, I should say, interesting combination there with the completion there to win the game for Ole Miss. For Oklahoma, they knock off unbeaten TCU. This is one of the other big upsets on the week. Number 2, number 3, and number 4 all losing this week. Oklahoma put up a great performance from Al Dingle to knock off TCU. Number 7, Oregon State gets their first loss of the season, losing to Cal in a great shootout there in Corvallis, 41-35. UCLA 45-36. Over Colorado. South Carolina gets a win. Florida blows out Georgia, who's having just a horrific season, absolute season of horrors for Kirby Smart. He may lose his job over this one as the Bulldogs get smoked. Texas falls to Texas Tech, so the Longhorns suffered defeats in back-to-back weeks. Jet Duffy, we talked about him at the beginning of the season as a player to watch. Big game from him, a couple of late touchdowns to lead the Red Raiders to the victory. And then Rutgers with one of the big upsets of the day. Quadrez Wadley, 4 touchdowns for Ohio State, but not enough as they fall. Rutgers scoring 17 unanswered points to win 31-28 and knock off number 4 Ohio State. So like I said, 2, 3, and 4 all go down. Number 7 goes down as well. Oregon loses to Stanford, so a big loss there for the Ducks. They've lost 2 in a row now. Washington needed triple overtime to escape an upset from winless Utah, 44-41. What a game there for the Huskies to keep their potential college football playoff hopes alive. If they'd have lost to Utah, I think it would have been all wrapped up for them. And around the country for those great performances, some understated guys. Quincy Roche for Temple, 3 sacks and forced a fumble, 6 tackles for a loss in their win over Tulsa. And Central Michigan senior halfback Mike Harwell, 282 yards on 32 carries and 4 touchdowns. Great game for him. Good to see a player that's a game-generated player. Anybody that's a redshirt senior was in the game in the rosters originally. Anybody younger than that is game-generated, so cool to see them get on the Player of the Week awards. Adam Koritz and Zarek Cooper of Boston College and Clemson, respectively, get your ACC Player of the Week honors. Artavis Pierce of Oregon State still atop the Heisman leaderboard, despite not particularly a stellar game in their first loss. We see Jawan Pass also went out injured. He should be okay for the remainder of the games this season, but he did leave the game against Syracuse injured. Also, Victor Viramontes of Cal and Dorian Thompson-Robinson, quarterbacks in the Pac-12. As you see, the Pac-12 really highlighting the Heisman Watch leaderboard right now. 3 teams sit atop the top 25. Houston, Penn State, and Alabama is number 1. Those are your 3 remaining undefeated teams in college football this season. Oklahoma, with their win over TCU, jumps up to 4, but the fact that they have 2 losses, I think, is going to keep them out of college football playoff discussion for quite some time, unless all of these other teams below them with 1 loss somehow lose. Oklahoma, and they're not going to have a Big 12 championship game either because the Big 12 doesn't have one, so best Oklahoma can finish is 10-2. So they're likely not going to be a factor in the college football playoff unless some absolute craziness happens. Pitt, you can see, drops to 8. TCU falls to 5. Oregon State drops to 10. And the big droppers of the week, Ohio State falls all the way to number 19 with their loss to unranked Rutgers. Texas also drops to 18 after their loss to Texas Tech. So those are your 2 big fallers of the week. Cal jumps up to 16 with their victory over Oregon State. So a big jump there for the Golden Bears. I think they're underrated even with just 1 loss. And you can see Ohio State, I thought it was crazy they fell this far, but they haven't really beaten anybody. They beat Oklahoma, of course. But beyond that, they've had very tight games against not exciting opposition. Notre Dame comes into the polls at 22 after their victory over Pitt. And you can see West Virginia hanging on at 25 at 6-1. Oregon falls out of the polls, so another big drop there. They fall from 12 to 26 after their loss to Stanford. In the ACC conference standings, if we take a look around the country, we can see your Pitt Panthers and Georgia Tech, who are due to face off this week. Basically, it's going to come down to them in the Coastal. Now, if Georgia Tech beats Pitt, they'll have the leg up on head-to-head, but that would give Miami at least an opportunity to potentially weasel their way in. If Pitt wins, they basically have almost a lockstep on the Coastal Division title. They would need to lose twice, and Miami would have to be one of the teams that beat them for them to lose the Coastal Division title. On the other side, Clemson is the team to beat there in the Atlantic. They have the head-to-head tiebreaker over Louisville, so they'd have to likely lose twice for anybody else to win that section of the conference. Now, in the ACC this week, some big games to take place. We can see Georgia Tech and Pitt is the big one on the slate, but Florida State at Clemson is another gigantic game. Florida State with 2 losses, they still are at least in with a shout for the Atlantic Division title. Now we look around the top 25, we can see we've got some big games coming up this week. Notre Dame taking on South Carolina. It's a non-conference showdown, obviously, but two teams that hope to potentially get into the New Year's Six bowls will go head-to-head. Oklahoma State still with hopes potentially for a Big 12 title. They take on Texas, who's on a 2-game losing streak and has been struggling as of late. They have gone from number 1 to number 18 now in the last 2 weeks. Florida State taking on Clemson, of course. That's a game between two teams with great talent. Florida State has struggled this year, and they've struggled the last couple of years, despite the fact they've been A+ rated every year. They'll look to knock off Clemson to keep their ACC Conference Championship hopes alive. Penn State on upset watch, potentially. Michigan, great talent that the Wolverines have. Jim Harbaugh's squad underachieving, and with another year that they've been on the decline, could his job potentially be at risk, despite the fact he has an A+ talent level team? Oregon looking to try and potentially keep their opportunity to repeat as Pac-12 champions alive, taking on 8-1 Cal, who's been very impressive this season, number 9 offense in the country. The Ducks, of course, on a 2-game losing streak. You got Houston looking to stay unbeaten as they head up to Ohio to take on Cincinnati, probably the most talented team not named the Cougars in the American Conference. So that's a great showdown between those two teams. Winner take all, likely for the American Conference Championship. When they face off, you've got Arkansas State looking to stay big. LSU, Alabama, even though LSU has struggled this year, Coach O looking to turn that team around after, of course, he led them to a national championship last year. Take on undefeated number 1 Bama in Tuscaloosa. That should be a great matchup. Joel Sykes, interesting, you'll note there, number 174 ranked prospect in the country, the left guard. He just visited Pitt last week. He's visiting Alabama this week, so we'll see if that swings his recruiting battle potentially as the Panthers host Georgia Tech, and they have a number of big prospects coming in for this game as well. The number 30 prospect in the country, Phil Nelson, the tight end out of Mundelein, Illinois. They've got Christian, an outside linebacker of Altoona. That's a position of need for Pitt. They've got a couple other guys that we'll talk about here visiting for this week, so it should be a great showdown between these two opponents. And of course, Georgia Tech, 4 wins, but they've all come in conference, and it's been kind of impressive that they've done it with the number 102nd ranked offense and 111th ranked defense. They don't even have a great turnover differential, so the fact that they've pulled out some of these victories is pretty incredible. The Panthers being at home, I think it's a game they should win, but stranger things have happened. Look at Georgia Tech's schedule. They got smoked by Ole Miss and Notre Dame to start the season. They lost to Houston last week. They've lost to Virginia Tech, but they beat Virginia, they beat North Carolina, they beat NC State, they beat Syracuse. They've beaten 4 ACC teams that are really struggling this year, but they've shown they can pull out games when things get tight, so who knows what's going to happen. Now, Kenny Pickett, of course, leading the Panthers. He had a great game last week, 340 yards, 16 touchdowns against just 10 interceptions on the season, 2 touchdowns last week, and no turnovers. That was the big key for the Panthers. They'd hoped to get their rushing game going, and Todd Sibley, though Jay Keys has been impressive this season, he is on the Biletnikoff watch list for this season so far. He's in the top 5 of potential Biletnikoff finalists for best receiver in the country. For Georgia Tech, Lucas Johnson is their leading quarterback. He missed last game due to an injury. I'm sure that didn't help them in their game against Houston. He will be back this week playing through a strained shoulder, but he should be good to go for a team that no longer runs the option and is turning things around with Lane Kiffin leading the offensive modification of this Georgia Tech scheme. Now, for us, of course, you can see we did lose out on a recruit and outside linebacker, Marlon Harris, and I wanted to talk about this going into this game because we talked about Joel Sykes is visiting Bama this week. Look how close we were to convincing Joel Sykes to sign with the Panthers. We were about 200 points away, and we missed out on one of our goals for the game. We didn't run for 100 yards. That would have given him, I think, 250 more points. If we would have done that, we would have got a commitment from Joel Sykes last week. So it's a huge miss for us. We do have some great targets coming this week, though. Phil Nelson, like I mentioned, 4-star tight end, is visiting. Nate Love, the tackle, is visiting. We got CJ Kirk, a quarterback we've been tracking, who's kind of come under the radar, should be visiting this week. We had to schedule that one, so it should be great for us. Now, we will be missing a couple of good players. Tyquan Sutton's still out, of course, with that broken vertebra for the season. We're also going to be missing Barry Jenkins. It's not listed on the injury report, but he picked up a concussion last week. He's still showing concussion-like symptoms. And so he'll be out this week. Adarion Mitchell will be starting in his place at outside linebacker. Now, Georgia Tech, they haven't been hit too bad by the injury bug. Lucas Johnson should be able to play still through his strained shoulder. They'll be missing their top halfback, though, Xavier Gant. And they do have their starting left tackle, Chris Banks, nursing a strained quadricep, but he's expected to play as well for the Yellow Jackets. And when we look at this Georgia Tech roster, they do have some talent. I was surprised considering how, their team rating isn't particularly great. Their statistics for the season aren't great, but they do have some good players on the team. That is for certain. The one guy you're going to have to watch out for is Lucas Johnson because he has 87 speed. He can run the football. They're more of a pass-oriented attack now. Like I said, Lane Kiffin has taken over. Paul Johnson was fired after the end of season 1, I believe, or season 2. And so Lane Kiffin was hired, and so they run a more pro-style, spread-oriented attack, and they use those guys to their advantage. Lucas Johnson can run, though, when they need him to. Phil Henry will be starting at halfback, as well as backed up by senior Damian Williams. Neither of them have spectacular speed. Their rushing attack hasn't been great this season, so I'm not particularly overwhelmed by that. If they had Xavier Gant in the lineup, he'd be much more impressive. I think he does have a little bit more speed, a little bit more ability to find those holes and get through some tackles. So I think we should be able to shut down Henry, which will be big because we'll force him to throw. Now, they do have a couple of good receivers. 2 big guys to watch out for. Paris Williams is their number 1 guy, a true junior, 90 overall, 90 speed. He's very, very good. And then redshirt senior Devon McClure was actually a transfer. I want to say, I can't remember, maybe from Arkansas. I'm not 100% sure where McClure transferred from, but he was a transfer and came to Georgia Tech this season, so he's played a role on them here in his redshirt senior year. They've also got leading target Tony Green, the senior tight end. He had 47 catches last year. Very impressive season, and he torched us last year. He was their number 1 target. I think he had 9 or 10 catches against us last year, so he's the guy to watch out for. Now, one thing I will say is their offensive line is hit or miss. They're decent. They have some good guys on there, especially the left side of their offensive line. The tackles are very good. Jahaziel Lee's solid. Middle of their line is a little bit questionable, so hopefully Ryan Jacobs and Darren Toth, who've been very, very impressive lately getting sacks, can make an impact for us in that fashion. They have a couple of good ends. Jordan Woods, very good, 4 sacks for them on the season for the senior. They've also got Adams up the middle and Clark, who's a youngster, but he's very, very good. Brandon Adams is a big boy, 6'2", 351. I think they actually used him a little bit at middle linebacker last season for some reason as like their backup. It was very interesting to see, and you can see they're very, very weak still at the middle linebacker position. Matt West and Carroll behind him, not particularly great talents. Matt West does have good speed, though, but otherwise not particularly solid. So if we can attack the middle of the field where he may be, I think that could be our best bet to make some moves, especially because they have Emmanuel Bridges on the outside, who's been very, very impressive for them at outside linebacker. Now, they're also weak at corner, which is good for us to see. Antonio Rivera, that's been good, though. I think he has 3 career interceptions. I think 2 of those might be against us. But they do have some corners that have a lot of speed, but not a ton of technical ability. And so I think what we'll look to do is use Jay Keys, use Paul Lease, use Benjamin Ogden, try and get them the football as much as possible, really show off that aerial attack, because not only that, but we have a tight end visiting, we have a quarterback visiting, and we want to impress them as much as possible so that we can make some big signings with our recruiting class. We still have 7 open scholarships available for the in-season recruiting portion, and then depending on what happens in the off-season, we may have 1 or 2 more scholarships free up. But as it stands right now, we have 7 open scholarships. We want to make a good impression on the guys that are visiting, potentially still convince Sykes to come. You can see when you looked at the top of our recruiting board, we got a fullback we're interested in Burgess. So we got some good players we want to bring in, and I think that it'll make for a very exciting recruiting class if we can have a big week this week, put up a ton of passing yards, a ton of points, and potentially convince those guys to come in. So as always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments, what do you think is going to happen between Pitt and Georgia Tech? What will the score be? Can we essentially get very close to wrapping up the ACC Coastal Division title this week and keep ourselves in the college football playoff conversation, and what's going to happen around the country? Appreciate you guys' comments. As always, hail to Pitt. We'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.